So my name is Kashif Shaikh. I know it can get there's different pronunciations, but Kashif is, I think particularly because there was like an 80s singer whose name was Kashif, which is weird because I didn't think people knew who that was, but it turns out a ton of people knew who that was. Yes, I'm Kashif Shaikh, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about a lot of different stuff, particularly around sort of my work at the Pillars Fund and sort of the work that we're doing to sort of empower American Muslim communities, and also just a little bit about American Muslim communities, because I think there's so much sort of that's misunderstood about our communities. And one of the first things is that, as you'll sort of hear me as I reference, is I don't ever reference our communities as one singular community, because I think that one of the really incredible things about American Muslims is the fact that it's so incredibly diverse. It's so incredibly, we span race, we span genders, we span ethnicity. And so the work with the Pillars Fund, the reason that I started the Pillars Fund, which is an organization that was initially started with a group of sort of philanthropists, young philanthropists, and the idea was our sort of communities had been, particularly after 9/11, but it definitely was happening pre-9/11 as well, was we were sort of being seen as this very, very specific and harmful community that was almost foreign. I'm another Ohioan. There's a lot of people from Ohio here, right? It's amazing. I'm from Cincinnati. It's where I grew up. I live in Chicago today. And I think for me, it was this idea that my dad immigrated to New York City in the late 70s to go to Pratt, to go to art school, was someone that sort of his entire life's goal was to be sort of a painter and a sculptor. And these are not the stories that we were hearing. You know, my dad was someone that came here and he and worked hard and did not sort of fall into a lot of these tropes that we were seeing that have been perpetuated. And so the Pillars Fund was an organization that I started with a group of philanthropists with the idea being, how do we direct resources and invest them into our civic leaders? Because one of the things that we were really finding was we were really being seen so much more as a religious community, and while obviously Islam is a religion, I think there's something really important to talk about the culture of American Muslims in this country. And in order to understand that culture, we really have to understand sort of the history of Muslims in this country. You know, there are reports that say up to 1/3 of enslaved peoples that came that were brought over to this country they were definitely from Muslim countries, and many of them were practicing Muslims, and their identities, not just their names and everything, were sort of ripped away from them, but their religious identities were also ripped away from them. And so there's this, this history of Muslims being in this country, and really, even when I sit in rooms like this and sit in so many different rooms, and I talk about the sort of the demographics of American Muslims, I'm met with so much sort of surprise. For example, most people don't know that 1/3, up to 25 to 33% of American Muslims are black. The way that young people are really understanding Islam and is through the black experience, because really it was African Americans that have shaped the way that Islam is sort of focused in this country. If you look at the turn of the century, from the Noble Drew Ali, who really sort of brought over Islamic themes into his congregation, to obviously in the civil rights movement with Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, who were really sort of knee deep in this idea of what Islam could do, particularly for black people. And so for us, with the Pillars Fund, what we wanted to do was really start to empower and invest. We knew there was wealth in our community. We knew there was ways to sort of invest, but we wanted to sort of find those next generation of leaders and next generation of people who we could really support. And one of the things that we were starting to discover was that we had to sit back and think about, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Like, why do we want to start the Pillars Fund? And part of the reason why I wanted to do it was I wanted to kind of shine a spotlight on the people who I grew up with the community that I knew. And I think for that, we had to think about, why is it that there is this sort of particular narrative around Muslims? And there's a reason for that. And I think the way that we've seen Muslims being portrayed in popular culture, this is an image that I think that it brings a lot of sort of, I want to leave this up here because this is a source of dread for so many Muslims, right? Aladdin was sort of perhaps it's like the most sort of Orientalist sort of trope of this idea that Muslims are this, foreign, like exotic, and even in the opening song, which later got cut out, there was literally a line in the opening song that said, they cut off your hands, hey, it's barbaric, but that's how it is. There's some line like that. And so I think for us, like, this is why Pillars was sort of doing the work that we were doing around culture, which was because we were sort of fighting against this very intentional sort of narrative that has been put forward around Muslims. And we saw this sort of obviously exacerbated after 9/11, where we saw this horrific sort of act. But what we were really seeing was the discourse. It was really interesting to see that image that you put up in the 90s around the Bush administration, around the way that the culture around toxic masculinity. I think about that time, and it's like such a weird and crazy time to think about, from like 2001 to 2007-ish, where we think about the ways, even when I think about the conversations that were happening around Muslims, you could turn on the news at any point at that time, and you would hear a lot about how they're terrorists, this and that. And that's the thing that was really crazy about this current cycle, this current election cycle, which, I felt like we were moving forward. And as people have said, the Obama administration was far from perfect. But this idea that Muslims were not otherized, I think, was an important part. But really what was happening with the Muslim ban that Donald Trump sort of proposed was, again, sort of going back to this idea that somehow Muslims are a foreign group of people. And the idea behind what Pillars is really attempting to do here is sort of talk about the ways that our community, and sort of highlight the community. This is the picture from the new Aladdin, which, I'll leave it at that. There was an incredible report that was done by my friend Dr. May Al-Hassan with the Pop Culture Collaborative called Huck in Hollywood. And I would encourage everyone to go and check this report out on their website. It's an incredible report that really sort of breaks down these tropes of how American Muslims have been sort of portrayed. And it goes from everything from sort of the timid female to the subservient female to this idea of kids being dangerous, to this idea of the only good Muslims are those that are working with the FBI and sort of exposing the bad ones. This very binary this narrative of sort of good versus bad has been what American Muslims have been sort of put into. I don't even really have to say much about these slides. I think they what happens with them is that you really sort of see the way that American Muslims have been portrayed for so long. And that's why the work with the Pillars Fund really started to think about, not only how do we sort of support our next generation of civic leaders, but everything that we were doing was really around culture change, even if that's not sort of how we had defined it in the early days. Because for us, it was a matter of sort of shining a spotlight on these organizations, on these leaders, and sort of showing what our community was doing. Part of the joy of my job has been going around the country and meeting with incredible people, whether it be in Arkansas, whether it be in Texas, whether it be in Florida, particularly young people who are no longer sort of really interested in telling the world who we're not, and are really starting to put out stories of who they are. And as so many other people up here have talked about, is this idea is not of positive narratives. The idea is not, it's more authentic. How do we sort of tell the stories of who we are? And to that end, I wanted to talk just for a minute or two about some of the work that Pillars has sort of gotten into around culture, because for us, it was a matter of how do we leverage popular media, not just in Hollywood, but how do we sort of build a network of young talent, of young leaders, whether it's authors, filmmakers, documentarians, and one of the projects that we really have been excited about that we are working with is a project called East of La Brea, which is, everything about this project I think is so unique. It was conceived by a gentleman, a Pakistani American from Los Angeles named Samir Gardezi, and he started working on the show. The idea was sort of to bring in a predominantly Muslim women to come and help write a show and sort of tell an authentic story of two Muslim women. And the idea wasn't to sort of center the story on their religion. The idea was to really sort of tell a story about these two women and the struggles of being a 20-something in Los Angeles. But while it doesn't sound like it should be groundbreaking, the idea that their Muslim identity was just a part of who they were was a really important part of this series. And so, we were really excited about this one because Paul Feig, who did Bridesmaids, and a few other got behind it, which also I think demonstrated kind of the structure in Hollywood that like ultimately in order for the show to get exposure, a white male had to like put his stamp of approval on it, which is that's a whole other conversation to be having around sort of these power structures that exist particularly in Hollywood. But the reality is that is what got this show noticed. That is what it's premiering at South by Southwest. The fact that Paul sort of used his platform to kind of highlight a show that was about Muslim women, I think was incredibly powerful. And so for us, and there's a sort of a renaissance happening in the American Muslim community of sort of young talent. Rami Youssef, who's sort of seen here, has a new show coming out on Hulu in just about a month about sort of growing up, what it's like being an American Muslim, living in New Jersey. And sort of, one of the really interesting things about Rami's show, and I've been fortunate enough to see a couple of episodes, is that what he really does is sort of really tackle this idea of like, what does it mean to be Muslim? Because the other trope that like Muslims have fallen into, and we saw this a little bit in The Big Sick, which was like, a movie that was really kind of, I almost didn't know how to feel about it, because on one hand, like Kumail is from the town that my mom grew up in. And so to see someone sort of achieve that level of fame, and to see him hosting SNL was incredible, but also the way that movie sort of depicted, like Muslim women, I think was incredibly problematic, but also this idea that like in order to be kind of cool and in order to be accepted, you kind of had to like disregard your Islamic identity, your Muslim identity, and I get it, I'm not criticizing him for the fact that that's his authentic story, and I respect that, but I think it's been sort of part of this larger pattern that in order to kind of be the cool Muslim, like, you're not that religious or you're not that sort of practicing. And I think what Rami's show, I think, does so beautifully, which I'm so excited for people to see, which comes out, is this idea of like, what does it mean to be Muslim? What does it actually mean to sort of not be perfect, be imperfect, but sort of be struggling to sort of live up to the ideals that you yourself really believe in? And so, we've seen this with shows like Hassan Minhaj. We saw Rashida spoofed on SNL, which was, really, so there's a moment right now, and part of what it is that what we want is, now they're just like famous Muslims, we're just putting them up there because it's like, we're gonna own this moment, right? Like, like this was like, and like Mahershala, which is like, again, a lot of people don't know that how much of his Muslim identity is sort of shaped the way that he sort of thinks. Thank you to everyone in this room. Thank you for sort of really kind of like being, this idea of intersectionality sort of gets talked about a lot, but a lot of the people in this room who I work with regularly really live and breathe this mission, and we really want Muslim communities to be represented, and Pillars is incredibly fortunate to be able to be building a pipeline of young leaders, pipeline of young creators, and giving them a home for the first time, which I think has been so necessary, and to be able to do it alongside with people like Crystal and others who are doing this for other communities is such an incredible honor. So with that, I'm going to stop, and thank you guys so much.